Hey everybody, it's been quite a long time since I've done a video about the cameras that I use for my live productions with my little business, Doug Johnson Productions, and figure it's probably about time to bring this up again. I get a lot of people asking me, like, what's the right kind of camera for me to use, for me to get in order to do video production, and well, there's no right answer to that question, but there was a right answer for me, and that's what I want to talk about. So the last video I did about this was all the way back in, I believe, the fall of 2016, so it's been 7 years. But surprise, surprise, I'm actually still using the same model of camera that I used way back then. And that's this one sitting here on the desk, the Sony PXW-Z150. Now, why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the types of events that I shoot and how I came to work with this style of camera, camcorder basically. I shoot primarily things like business conferences, sporting events, concerts, those kinds of things, which means that we work in every type of venue under the sun, indoor, outdoor, stadiums, indoor conference rooms, you name it. The rooms can be anywhere from really small to huge, and I needed a camera that's going to allow me to work in those situations and cover them pretty well without any major sacrifices. And because of that, that's where I landed on camcorder style cameras. I know a lot of people who watch YouTube videos are, I should say, a little bit leery of the camcorder form factor. And as I interact with people, and I tell people that I use these things, I get a lot of people saying, "Oh, why are you doing that?" Because, you know, it seems like the mentality for most of the YouTube community is you should be shooting on studio style cameras, or maybe on mirrorless cameras, or a few years ago DSLR cameras. And I've tried all of those things, and they just don't work as well for the types of things that I shoot. So let me be clear, if those cameras are what you have and they work well for you, great. You know, I'm not going to criticize your choice. Only you are going to know what's best for you. But for me, I have found that camcorders like this are the best type of equipment that I can use for the types of events that I shoot. And why is that? Well, let's talk a little bit about this model specifically. So again, this is the Sony PXW-Z150. So first of all, this is a 1-inch sensor camera, which means that the sensor in this camera is way bigger than you'd find with other camcorders that we've used in the past. It's even bigger than most of the sensors that are in broadcast cameras. Most of those are 2/3 inch. This is a 1-inch sensor. So it's noticeably bigger, which means that it's got better light gathering capability than a lot of the other ones that are out there. Certainly better than your consumer camcorders. About 9 times the size of a consumer camcorder if you do the math. And so it's capturing a lot more light than you get with a lot of the other camcorders that we've seen in the past. So 1 inch gives you a lot more surface area in order to capture more light. Being a sensor that's that much bigger than other ones gives you the ability to have some control over depth of focus. You get a smaller sensor, and pretty much everything is always going to be in focus, more or less. The larger the sensor, the shallower your depth of field is, so it means the less of your image is going to be in focus depending on the depth of your subject versus the background and foreground and so forth. So this one has just enough control of that I felt like I can produce a high quality, pleasing image, but not drive my camera operators crazy trying to maintain focus. And it's worked out exactly that way. This camera has been absolutely fantastic in pretty much every situation that I put it in. I can put it in a situation where the subject is up close and there's a lot of distance behind into the background, and it does a good job of giving us a little bit of blur there. But we put it in a conference room, a convention center, where the speaker is moving around like crazy, and I don't have to worry that they're going to go out of focus. I don't have to worry that the camera operators are going to revolt on me because they're spending the whole time adjusting the focus ring in order to make sure that the subject actually stays in focus. So I found that this is a really good balance between those two ends of the extremes, those extremes in terms of sensor size versus being able to maintain focus. So broadcast, they've settled on 2/3 inch, and one of the reasons they chose that size is because it's more forgiving in terms of focus than when you get into bigger sensors as well. So the next thing I want to mention about this is it's a 20 megapixel sensor. Now, it's a 4K camera, and I'm able to shoot 4K, and I do that here for my YouTube channel. But the nice thing about that is because you got all that extra data, you've got a lot of clarity in the image, a lot of detail. It captures an awful lot of detail. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But it also allows you to crop in on the sensor without losing any detail. And this camera has something that's called clear image zoom. It's Sony's technology that kind of extracts more detail out of the image than is actually there. And it does a really good job of it. Now, the optical zoom on this camera is only 12 times, which means that from the widest to the tightest that it will zoom in optically is 12 times. But because of that clear image zoom, that actually doubles that zoom range. So effectively, I'm getting a 1:24 ratio on this camera, and it looks great. You can't tell, looking at the image in post, that it's cropping in on the sensor. And part of that is because the sensor is capturing a lot more detail than it's actually recording. So that clear image zoom feature is actually works really, really well, and that gives me a lot more zoom range on this than I can get on a lot of other cameras that are out there. All that extra zoom range, control over depth of field, really good autofocus. This thing works with in a lot of situations, and a lot of times when I don't have camera operators who might not necessarily be so experienced. So anyway, besides that, one of the nice things about this one, it actually has an SDI connector on the back. And you get into a lot of other cameras that are kind of in this segment in the market, and all you get is HDMI. SDI is just so much more reliable. It's so much more robust. And it's designed for doing long cable runs. It's designed to walk and stay put. It's designed for abuse. It's designed to be pretty rugged. It's going to hold up really well. And in fact, that has been the case. So I've used this model camera for 7.5 years. It's always worked just fine. I've never had any problems with the SDI. The one downside to this model is the SDI only does 1080, and so if I want to shoot 4K, I do have to use the HDMI port on this. Another thing I like about this camera is, frankly, its price. So when this first came out, it was $3,700. It's currently $3,000. So it's come down a little bit since it first shipped. And the first three that I bought, I paid that higher price. For $3,000, you're getting a lot of camera. So you compare that to some of the other options out there. Say, for example, you might get a Blackmagic Studio camera, and then you got to put a lens on it. And all of a sudden, if you're getting a decent lens, you're more money than this, and you're getting a camera that's less flexible, less capable in most situations. And if you want to get a lens that does 24 times zoom on a camera like that, well, you can't. They don't really seem to exist. If you get into the broadcast realm, you certainly can, but then you're talking tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for a lens on top of the price of your camera. So the fact that I can do 24 times zoom on this camera and it only cost me $3,000 is frankly quite amazing. And I put this up against other cameras that I've tried, and it holds its own. It does just as well or better than pretty much everything else out there. I'm sure there's going to be some higher end ones that are going to do better for sure, but they're going to cost a lot more. So the $3,000 price on this camera is frankly a bit of a steal when you want to have high quality imagery and you need a camera to operate in a very wide variety of different situations. Now, I do want to mention that not everything about this camera is rosy and perfect and amazing. There are some limitations of this camera that, frankly, kind of drive me a little bit nuts. And the main reason for a lot of them is because I think when Sony developed this camera that it wasn't redesigned from the ground up to do 4K. It does 4K, and it does okay at 4K, but at its heart, it really is more of a 1080p camera. I do shoot in 4K, and this is the family of camera that I use here on my YouTube channel, not just here in my trailer, but also in my basement studio as well. And the image quality has been great. I've not had any significant issues with it. But it is when you go into 4K, it is 8-bit and it's 420 instead of 10-bit and 422 like it is in 1080. Now, you tell me, those of you who are watching this video, what do you think? Is the image quality awful? Is it terrible? Is it not as good as you might get with something else? Well, that's subjective. But I do believe that the image processing in this camera is pretty good, and so that 8-bit 420 limitation in 4K has never been a deal breaker for me. I've never had to go into anything in post and tweak it so much that the things start to fall apart. Image quality coming out of this has just been good enough, which is great because in live production you don't necessarily have a chance to color things the way that you might want to do in post. Another thing that kind of drives me nuts about this camera, again because of this 4K thing, is that if you want to record internally in the camera and you want to output the video, you have to choose either the LCD screen or the HDMI port on the back. Once you start recording, one of those two shuts off. That's just a limitation. All of the cameras in this family, they all do it. They all do the exact same thing. And so you have to make some sacrifices. In the case of when I'm working with these things, I usually choose to have the video come out the port on the back, and then the screen goes black. But I work around that by putting an LCD screen on top of the camera and show the image that way. And that's worked very well. That's been a pretty good solution for whenever I've needed to do 4K in the field. Now that limitation only exists in 4K, it doesn't exist in 1080, and so it's never been a problem. Speaking of 1080, one of the things that I like about this model in particular is the SDI port will output at 30 frames per second, which is pretty rare. I like to shoot at 30 frames per second for most of the events that I do, unless I'm doing sports or something that's related to movies, and the 30 frames per second is just a very good compromise there. And fortunately, this camera will output 1080p at 29.97 frames per second on the SDI port only. But that's been great because I can feed that right into my switcher, and I don't have to do any sort of conversion on the signal in order to make that work. Alright, well, I've got this out and take you on a very brief tour of what's on the camera. So if this is something you might be considering, you can kind of see what you might be getting. So we'll just kind of start here on the top. We've got our LCD screen here. It flips out like so. It does flip around to the front, so somebody in front of the camera can see what's going on. The menu button right here, and the buttons for navigating the menu are up here on top, which is a little weird, but you do get used to it. I'm able to operate it while it's on a tripod above my head and do just fine. So you get used to it. It's not a huge problem. We've also got a zoom lever here on top. This is actually a single speed one, so no matter how hard you press it, it always goes one speed. That speed is set in the menu. We've got a record start stop button here, so there's one here, and there's also one back here. It goes by your thumb if you're hand holding. These are programmable, so you can say I want this one to record to slot B and this one to record to slot A, or vice versa, or any combination thereof. So kind of cool that it has that. There is a shotgun microphone holder up here. It does not ship with this microphone. That's one that I had from another Sony camera. I just popped it on here and it works really well. I love having that there. Alright, you can also see here the zoom lever. One of the limitations of this camera is that the slowest zoom speed on here is just not as slow as I would like it to be. I can't really do a super slow crawl in and out. It's slow enough that I can use it in a lot of situations, but it would always be nice for it to be slower. And you step up to some of the higher end models, you say for example get to the Z280, and you do get a much slower crawl zoom on that one compared to this. We've also got a couple buttons over here. These are programmable buttons, so default to last scene, so you can see the last shot that you took. Focus magnification, so you can really crop in and see if you're got critical focus or not as well. Okay, and then I just very briefly took a look over here on the side. We've got two XLR microphone inputs over here. We've got your hand grip here. This is an NFC thing for pairing with your phone, and then we've got we'll get around here to the back. We've got, this is probably going to be a lot of focus for you, but SDI audio outputs on RCA, an HDMI port, a USB port, which is really, you can use it to transfer footage, but it's not very fast. And you've got a DC power input here. And you've got the battery back here. This Sony takes the NPF style batteries. And then we've got two card slots, uses SD card. You can do a memory stick in the upper one. I don't think they even make any memory sticks that are fast and big enough anymore. And then we've got our headphone jack output over here, and then a LANC, LANC input here for control via a remote control for zooming and that kind of thing. Okay, and we'll take a look over here at the side. We've got, this is one of the things I really love about this camera. You actually have separate rings for focus, zoom, and iris. Dedicated rings on the camera. These are all electronic. They're not hard connected to the lens mechanism itself, but it's super nice having dedicated rings for all of those things. So you're shooting an event, you discover that lighting is changing, you need to adjust your exposure, you just grab that iris ring, turn it, and you can compensate. We've got several buttons up here to control the various aspects of the camera, and the first three are actually programmable. You can change what they happen to do. And just below that, we've got the switch for the neutral density filter. It can do clear 1, 2, or 3. It's not like some of the newer Sony cameras where you have a variable density that you can adjust in very fine increments. This has just 3 settings: 1/4, 1/16, and 1/64 as well. And then we've got a button here for switching between auto and manual iris, and then a button for choosing auto or manual focus. We'll mention the autofocus on this camera is actually pretty good, though newer models in this family do a little bit better. Some of the newer models actually add a phase detect autofocus, which this one is just contrast detect. Okay, then we've got some pretty good controls here for audio. For each channel we can choose whether it's line mic or mic with phantom power, and we can choose the microphone source, external, internal, or the MI shoe, which I should mention is right up here. So take this cover off, and that's actually a hot shoe with electronics in it, and you can use that to connect up Sony wireless microphones and lights and some other things there as well. So you're able to control where your audio is coming from, and that's independent of the two on each of the two channels. So you can be using XLR on one and the internal mic on the other. Then we've got auto or manual level, and if you put it on manual, you've got a dial here to control that. I've had pretty good luck with the audio on these cameras. It's actually relatively clean. It gives me enough range to control that I'm able to accommodate pretty much every type of signal that someone sends to me. Down here, across the bottom, we've got our controls for gain, white balance, shutter, and then full auto, which I never ever use. But then there's a little toggle switch here that allows you to adjust each one of those things. If you want to adjust the gain, for example, you press gain first, and then you toggle the switch up and down, and that lets you do that in 3 decibel increments. It's not like other cameras where you have a 3-way switch, low, medium, high. You can actually go anywhere from -3 up to +33 decibels on this camera. This camera is fairly clean up to +9 decibels, usable at 12, sometimes usable at 15. I wouldn't push it much higher than that unless you actually have to. Though that said, that range is much better than a lot of the other cameras that I've used. White balance, you have 3 different settings, A, B, and then preset. To change the preset, you have to go in the menus. Something I don't necessarily love, but at least you do have that control. So you can either set it to indoor, outdoor, or set your own Kelvin color temperature in the menu. You've got one for adjusting shutter speed, and that can either be done by fractions of a second or by shutter angle. You choose that in the menu. Again, full auto, turn that on and off if you want the camera to figure out how to do everything. And then here is your power switch right here. The other thing I'll mention is actually has a lens cover built right in. So you flip this switch right here, and that opens and closes the shutter on the front of the lens right there, which is super nice. I love that feature. There's another model of camera in this family that does not have that, and drove me nuts to the point where I went out and actually bought one of these and put it on that camera just for that consistency and to have that convenience. Okay, all right, so that's kind of the gist of the Z150. Again, stick around to the end of the video, and I'll show you how I have my image preset set up on here in order to achieve the kind of look that you're seeing here, and the one that I found to work in an awful lot of different situations. Okay, so the next camera I want to show you looks identical from the outside, but it is a little bit different. So can you tell just by looking what the difference between these two cameras is, aside from the microphone, which doesn't come with this one? Well, from the outside, they look pretty much identical. In most ways, they actually are. So, but the one here on the left, this is the Sony HXR-NX100. This is actually a little bit older model than the Z150, but they are so close, they are so similar, that if you don't need 4K, you can get away with this camera and basically get all the functionality you might need. So let me just kind of talk a little bit about some of the differences. Alright, so the biggest difference for me is this one does not have SDI output. So you come back here, and it does have a BNC, and I've actually taped it up, but that's actually composite video. It's like standard definition composite video. So yeah, and that's something we're going to be using here in the modern day. So what does have HDMI. They both have HDMI, and so if I'm using this camera, I do have to use the HDMI output on there, which, as mentioned in the last camera, means that the output is either 24 frames per second or 60 frames per second. Does not output 30 frames per second natively, even though it will shoot and record 30 frames. Just a weird limitation that Sony has placed on their cameras. I have to make up for that by running it through a decimator converter, but anybody who has a modern video switcher, that's not really of a concern. And the switcher I use here in my trailer still requires that all the inputs be of the exact same format that the switcher is using internally. So I do have to run through a converter if I'm using this when I'm shooting 30 frames per second. Okay. Other than that, they are more or less identical. As I mentioned, this one did not come with the fancy shutter switch thing, so I bought one for it. You know, it just makes it so much more convenient having that on there than not. Aside from that, though, they are essentially nearly identical. They have basically all the same image processing capabilities, except for this is HD only, and the Z150 does 4K. But since they process image the same way, I can mix and match between the two, and it's not a problem. So for most events, of course, I use my Z150s first of all. I have 4 of those, and if I run out of those, then I can start using some of the other cameras that I have in my arsenal, which are mostly of the same family, including this NX100, and they just intercut with each other perfectly. The menus are the same, the image output is the same, the lenses are the same, more or less the same, the sensors are more or less the same. You can't tell the difference between one camera to the next. So anyway, this is a great option for anybody who wants to have a high quality image, doesn't need 4K, and SDI is not a necessity. The downside to this one is it's been discontinued for a couple years, so if you want one of these, you got to pick it up used on eBay or some other place like that. That's actually where I got this one. I just recently added this to my collection as I wanted to have one more camera on top of what I already did, and I was able to get it for a pretty reasonable price. When this was actually being sold, it was sold for about $1,700, so more than $1,000 less than the Z150. So if you're buying multiple cameras and 4K is not an option, that would have been a decent way to go. I did have one of these years ago, but I sold it in order to get another Z150. But I came back and got another one again because I actually do like it, and it worked really well. Okay, the next camera I want to talk about is another camera in the same family, but it's in a very different form factor. So I got my Z150 here on the left, and this over here is the Z90. Alright, so let's take a little bit of a tour of this camera. So obviously it looks quite a bit different. It's a very different form factor than the Z150, but in terms of its capabilities, it's actually very similar, in some ways a little bit superior. So this is a slightly newer model. The Z150 came out in 2016. This model came out in 2018. So Sony actually did update the technology a little bit in that time. And one of the things they did is they moved from contrast-based autofocus to phase-detect autofocus. So the autofocus on this camera is actually quite a bit better than it is on the Z150. Not that the Z150 is bad, but this one is just that much better. The downsides, though, because it's a smaller form factor, you lose some of the manual controls that you have on the Z150, and depending on what you're shooting, that may or may not be a problem, but yeah, you do have less control. So you've only got one ring on here for control, and you either change that to zoom or focus. I almost always leave it on focus because in terms of zoom, there's always the rocker over here, but there's no built-on external ring for controlling iris. If you want to control iris on this camera, you have to press the iris button down here and then adjust it with the little wheel. So yeah, not near as convenient. Most of the other controls are available here, so we've got buttons for ISO or gain, shutter speed, like we did on the other one, and then the white balance one is actually on the inside. Fewer buttons, but you're not really making much of a huge sacrifice in terms of being able to shoot and get a high quality image. Another difference about this one is this is actually a touch screen. It's not used for a lot of things, but it does have the capability to be able to touch on whatever you want to focus on. So if you find that the camera's not focusing on the right thing, you can go into the menu, turn that feature on, and then tap on the screen and tell it whatever you want to maintain focus on, and it will actually lock on that as the subject moves around. So you're not having to constantly adjust it if you're shooting the same subject over and over and over again. Another big difference about this one is it uses different batteries. The battery life with these batteries is way less, a lot less than the bigger batteries you get on the Z150. So that has sometimes been an issue for me. I've made sure to stock a whole bunch of these batteries because they don't last anywhere near as long. On the Z150, I can get 4+ hours on a battery. This one, it's kind of, if you're getting more than 2, you're feeling kind of lucky. Okay, all right, a few other things we have on the back. We actually do have an SDI on this. Something you don't necessarily get on camcorders of this size, but it does have an SDI output in addition to the HDMI that's there as well. You got your AC power on there, you got your start button, and then the joystick right here for navigating the menu. So unlike the Z150 where those controls are up top, it's actually here on the back, and this is actually easier and a better location. The placement over here of the neutral density filter switch is a little bit weird, and you've got your full auto or manual control switch up here. Again, never change it anywhere from manual. One of the things that's very different, let me pull this microphone off here, about this one, the rocker on top for controlling the zoom is variable speed, unlike on the Z150 where it's manual or fixed. So you can actually switch that over here. So you can turn the rocker off, set it to variable speed, or set it to fixed speed. And again, that fixed speed is controlled in the menu. You do have a button here for start stop, and this one actually has a lock on it, so you can prevent that from somebody from accidentally bumping that. And something that the Z150 again does not have. And you've got a couple of customizable buttons over here on the side, as well as one over here. You do have XLR inputs on this one, although unlike the Z150, you can't mix and match which inputs you're using. So if you want to use XLR on this one, you have to use both XLR. You can't use XLR and internal mic. There's just no way to select that in the menus. Hardware obviously capable is something that they decided to leave out. You also have a microphone input over here, and then a USB connection over here. Again, the USB on these is not super useful. In terms of the imaging, the lens is at least as good. It's actually the same size, even though it looks a lot smaller than the one on the Z150. It's the same size. It's 62 millimeter thread. Same f-stop on this one as the Z150. So overall, in terms of overall capabilities of this camera, it's actually extremely similar to the Z150. And as I shoot with this one and the Z150 at the same time, I can cut back and forth between the two, and you can't tell the difference, especially once you get in and adjust the picture profile settings to make them match. They just intercut super well. Same capabilities in terms of 20 megapixel sensor, same clear image zoom, same 24 times zoom using clear image or 12 times using optical across all the cameras in this family. So as I talk about the other models, that is actually applicable to all the different ones that are out there. Alright, the next one I'm going to show you here, again, looks functionally identical. You see a lot of similarities across different models here. So the Z90 is over here. This one right here is the HXR-NX80. So the same prefix as the other one that I showed you a bit ago, but this is much more similar to the Z90. Both of these have the same imaging capabilities, the same lens, the same sensor. All these do HDR, by the way. I failed to mention that. So they all do HDR. But in terms of the ability to capture an image, they're identical. So you're not going to find that you're going to get a better image out of one versus the other, even though these are all coming at different price points. They all have the same ability to capture images. They do have slightly different capabilities in terms of what formats that they will record. So the Z150 and the Z90 will record in XAVC-L, whereas some of the other ones are limited to XAVC-S. And then there's another one I'm going to show you, the next one here in the lineup, I'm going to show you, which only does MPEG-4. In terms of what that means, that's not really much difference from one to the next, but there is that slight difference between them. In terms of the capabilities of the camera, these are extremely similar. The Z90 has some live streaming capabilities that the NX80 does not. This one also does not have the SDI port on the back like the Z90 does, but other than that, they are very similar. And you even get the XLR inputs on this one, even though it's not the highest model in the lineup. Okay, so there's actually one more camera in this particular series, and I didn't show it earlier because I wouldn't call it necessarily a professional camera, although it certainly can supplement some of the other ones. So we've got the Z90 here, we've got the NX80 here, and then this one over here is called the FDR-AX700. These three models of camera all came out at the same time. Their capabilities are very similar from one model to the next. They all shoot 4K, they all have 12 times optical, they all have the clear image zoom to get you out to 24 times. They all have HDR capabilities, they all have the phase detect autofocus. A lot of very similar capabilities. The main differences between them are going to be in some of the connectivity. So SDI, HDMI on, and then HDMI on these two. This one's obviously got your top handle that has the XLR, whereas this one does not. But again, they're very similar, and if you don't need that fancy audio capabilities of these other ones, you can probably get an AX700 and call it good. There's an older version of this one called the AX100, which is actually quite similar as well. So if you want to get one that's even a little bit cheaper but gives you very similar image quality, you can certainly pick one of those up as well. Now, these cameras are the ones that I use in my basement studio when I'm shooting videos here for the channel. So they tend to stay there, tend to live there. I prefer to leave them there. But if I ever am hired to do an event where my 5 other cameras are not going to be enough, I can grab these 3 and then grab the one that I'm shooting with here on this channel. That gives me a total of 9 of the cameras in this family, and I'm able to cover pretty much all events with that combination of cameras. 9 is a lot, and I actually have others on top of that as well that I can bring in when I need to. So anyway, so these are the 3 newest models in my lineup. And the NX80 has been discontinued. It's not for sale any longer, but the Z90 and the FX700 are still available. So great cameras, and if you're looking for something in this lineup, those are going to be some very good options. Now, there's actually one more camera in this family that I own that I'm not going to show you here on my desk, and that's because I'm using it to shoot this video. This is the Sony PXW-X70, so it's older than all these other ones that I've shown you. It also is a 4K camera. It did not ship with 4K enabled out of the box. It was actually an optional software upgrade that came later on. Fortunately, my model does have that, and that's one of the reasons I use it here on this channel. It's like I'm able to do the 4K on that camera. The autofocus on it is the weakest of all the ones that I own, but it still does a halfway decent job. But because it's kind of falls at the bottom of the capabilities of this family, of all the ones that I own, I've left it here in the trailer. It's just for YouTube videos. I do occasionally pull it out for other events, but for the most part, I try to leave it there in place at all times. So with that one, that actually means that I have 9 cameras that are part of this family. I've got 4 Z150s, I've got the NX100, I've got the Z90, I've got an NX80, I've got the AX700, and then the X70. That's a total of 9 if you're adding it up and doing the math in your head. They all work great together. I can mix and match these things freely, no problem whatsoever. They all work really, really well. They all have same image quality, basically. They all have the 20 megapixel sensor. They all have 12 times optical zoom with clear image zoom out to 24 times. So I'm able to cover a wide variety of events, no problem whatsoever. They all have the same capabilities in terms of color processing as well, with a couple of exceptions. So the X70 and the NX100 do not do HDR. All the other models do. Not that I shoot HDR very often, but if I did get hired to shoot in HDR, that does limit my capabilities a little bit. At that point, I've only got 7 cameras instead of 9. So, anyway, these cameras are great. I love them. They've worked super well. They're not the most high end, but they cover my needs really, really well, and they do produce a fantastic image, especially for the price point. So I've been super happy with them. In terms of image quality, stick around, and I'm going to be pulling the Z150 back out and take you through the image settings that I have on that. So if you actually have one of these cameras in this family, you can see the settings that I use that give me a very high quality image without being overly sharp or too noisy or too contrasty. Just something that's very pleasing in pretty much every situation that's out there. Okay, so I wanted to interject a couple of things. I was just working on editing this video, and I noticed there was a couple of things that I forgot to mention and are probably worth including in the video. So first of all, I want to mention a couple other cameras that I do happen to use, in addition to the ones that I've shown, the Sony 1-inch sensor camcorder style. So in addition to those, there's other times when I need to have something that's really small, and so for that I use the Sony action camera. This is model FDR-AX3000. I've got 2 of these. They have got great image quality for a little action camera like this, and they actually do shoot in 4K, and they have an HDMI output on the back that actually works really well. Unfortunately, some of the other manufacturers that are out there, GoPro, don't have consistent output on their HDMI port, and so they're kind of a pain to use. But these, I just plug in HDMI and it works. I don't have to do any sort of weird conversion with it or anything like that. Unfortunately, these have been discontinued for quite a while. So anybody who wants one, the only place to get them is on eBay, and they sell for quite a bit more on eBay now than they sold for brand new. So it's unfortunate, but that's kind of the way things are. It doesn't appear Sony's trying to come up with anything that's an exact upgrade path from this one. They do have some small little box cameras that are more GoPro style form factors, but they aren't really the same thing in terms of being able to handle wide variety of environmental conditions and whatnot. So it's something we've kind of lost. The other one I want to mention here is the FDR-AX53. This is very much a consumer camcorder here. I don't use this one in shots that actually get recorded or go live. This is more for things that are for reference for me here in the trailer. Like for example, if I'm shooting a sporting event, this is the camera that I will set up to shoot the scoreboard so I can grab score data for graphics off of it. Or in other situations, I might need to just set up a camera with a wide shot so I can kind of see a bird's eye view of everything going on in a particular venue. So if I'm outside in the trailer and need to see what's going on inside the venue but don't want to set up a shot that's actually going to be included as part of the production, this is very often the camera I will use for that purpose. And so it's nice to have as a point of reference, but the image quality on this one is just not quite up to snuff in terms of something that I would actually include as an output for going to a client. In sunlight, this camera does okay, but you start to get indoors and the image just falls apart too much. It's way too noisy. You lose too much detail in low light. So not something I would use for professional use. Now, you probably noticed that like every camera that I've talked about in this video is made by Sony. And there is a reason for that. And it's not because of Sony and who they are. It's because when you're doing a video production, you really need for all of your cameras to match and have the same look to them, so that when you're cutting from camera A to camera B, you don't get jarring changes in color or exposure or even level of detail or anything like that. So it's very important that you make sure when you're buying out your cameras that you're able to get all the models that you need from one particular vendor, and preferably within one product line within a vendor, because if you go from one product line to another, the color rendering is likely to be very different. And we see that with every manufacturer out there. So it doesn't matter which one you're choosing, you kind of need to stay within the same family, the same product line, if at all possible. So something to be aware of, like when you're going to build out your equipment, try to choose cameras from the same manufacturer and the same product line. Otherwise, you're going to find that you get jarring changes from one shot to the next when those cameras aren't set up correctly. And I will even go so far as to say that there's no amount of color correction that you can perform in either in camera using whatever fancy color correction capability it might have, or by applying a LUT after the fact. There is nothing you can do that's going to give you an exact match between cameras that are from different product lines. So I wouldn't necessarily even take the time to do that. I've tried to do that in the past, and I had very limited success with that. And so it's coming from someone who's tried many times and never really had what I would call a very successful experience doing that. I would have to say, just try and avoid that as much as you possibly can. So if you're just starting out and buying new equipment, just get everything from the same product line and save yourself that headache. It's gonna pay dividends in the long run in order to make sure you're doing that compromise. Okay, with that, let's actually get back to the rest of the video. Alright, got the Z150 hooked back up again here, and I'm going to take you through the picture profile menu and show you how I have my camera set up. So these cameras use what is called a picture profile in order to adjust the color and exposure and some other aspects of the image. They actually have quite a bit of adjustment right there in the camera. The downside is you can only control this through the menu. There's no remote control capability of this aspect of these cameras, and so you kind of got these set these things up ahead of time before you start shooting. You're not going to have the ability to control it from even a smartphone or whatever, so it has to be done in the menu on the camera. Alright, so if this is a camera that you're actually going to be looking into getting, or anything in this family, the picture profile is the way that we control the various aspects of the quality of the image, coloring, exposure, all sorts of stuff. And that's going to be found here in this first camera menu. So I'm going to press OK on that to select that, and then I'm just going to arrow up because it happens to be at the bottom of this menu. On the small versions of these cameras, they actually have a dedicated picture profile button. For some reason, the Z150 and the NX100 do not. You have to go in the menu to get here. But here I'll go ahead and hit select on that, and you can see a selection of various picture profiles. From the factory, these ship with picture profile 4 turned on. I don't like the look of picture profile very much at all. So one of the very first things that I do with these cameras is I go into the menu, turn on picture profile 1, and then that's pretty good for most situations, but I've over time learned to tweak this a little bit in order to give me a better quality image in a wide variety of situations. So in order to actually change the picture profile on here, I'm going to hit set to go into the menu, and then you can either hit OK to select it, or you can go down here into settings. So I'm going to hit setting on that, and here we actually have the settings that we're going to want to choose. So the first one here, black level -1. This gives just a touch of extra contrast in the image, which also gives a little bit of pop in the color. Not so much that it seems artificial, and it doesn't even necessarily look like it's been boosted, but it does help with the wow factor of the image just a little bit. The next thing I would do here is I'm going to come down here to Gamma ITU-709. It's got a lot of different settings in here. HLG is the HDR settings, by the way, but you've got some cinematone, things like that. You can see in the background that is affecting the image as I navigate through the menu. So this ships on standard. I like the ITU-709 a little bit. It gives what I think is a little bit more pleasing, a little bit more realistic image than some of the other options. So again, it's ITU-709 on that one. And then for black gamma, I set this range to high, and that gives us a little bit more detail in the blacks, and so things don't appear to be quite so crushed. So I set it to high, and then I set the level to +6, so it's actually tweaking that quite a bit. From the factory, this is set to medium and +3, I believe, and I like it better on high +6. Okay, let's go back out here in the menu. The knee setting on here. So the knee is kind of how the camera handles the highlights that would normally be clipped. So turning on the knee allows you to roll that off a little bit so you're able to maintain and preserve some of the details in the highlights of your image without them going complete white, completely blown out without any detail whatsoever. So I set mine to manual, and then I come down here to the manual set, and I set the point to 85%, and then to -3. And I found that if I go any lower than 85, that the camera really starts to do weird things with the colors in the highlights. They kind of go yellow, and so I've set that at 85. And that gives me just enough extra latitude in the highlights that I'm able to handle situations where we've got more sunlight, or we've got a spotlight or something like that that's blowing out a portion of the image. This really helps a lot in terms of making sure that we preserve as much detail as we possibly can. Okay, so we'll go out to the menu here, go to the next setting. Color mode, ITU 709 matrix. I should mention that the 709 that it's referring to, that's going to be Rec 709, or ITU 709 as they like to call it. That's kind of the industry standard for color for high definition. So if you want the camera to look like broadcast, kind of like your standard, the ITU 709 is going to be where you want to be. There are also some other ones in here, like you can shoot black and white. You've got some cinematone for giving it a more film-like look. But again, I find that I like the ITU 709. It handles things across the board in a wide variety of situations really well. Okay, next one in here. I do boost the saturation on my images just a little bit. So I've got it set at +3. You can see that it goes a lot higher than that. But +3 I found gives it just a little bit of a boost there in order to make things pop just a little bit more than they might naturally. Sony cameras tend to oversaturate things just a little bit anyway, but this gives it just a little bit more. Color phase I set to +2. That brings things over into the magenta a little bit more than green, and I find an image that has a little bit more magenta or pink in it is more pleasing than one that has too much green. And so just adding a little extra boost on the color phase there helps with that a lot. The color depth I don't play with, but this allows you to control the depth of red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow. So if you find that one of those colors is off, or overly or underly saturated, you can come in here and tweak that. You can say, for example, hey, I want my greens to be a lot more vibrant. You can crank that up there, and that aspect of the menu as well. Okay, color correction. I have this set off, but you've got color revision and color extract. This kind of gimmick. Color extract is the one where you can basically say, I want anything that's red to stay red, but everything else to go black and white. So not something that you would typically want to do, but there are some color correction options in here as well. You can store some settings and bring them back. Alright, so that's not something I typically use very much. White balance shift, I set this to LBCC, and then I set the LB to +1 and leave the other ones at 0. Alright, detail. So this is kind of the Sony sharpness control. I find that out of the box, these cameras are just a little bit too overly sharp. They do capture an awful lot of detail. These have fantastic lenses, they have great sensors, but the image, in my opinion, is just a little bit too sharp. And so I come in here and I set that detail to -1. Just take the little bit of an edge off. This also helps with noise a little bit too. If you're shooting in a situation where noise is going to be a real problem, you can come in here and dial this back even more, and that will help to kind of soften that noise out of the image just a little bit. Alright? Okay, and the settings here, manual, I've basically had this turned off, so I don't ever use that. And with that, that's going to be the last of the settings that I mess with here on these cameras. Now, if somebody's going to be shooting HDR with one of these cameras, that's going to be stored in Picture Profile 10. Not something I do very often, but if I come down here to Picture Profile 10, that puts it into HLG mode. You can see Gamma HLG2 has 3 different settings for different types of scenarios where you're shooting, but that's how you're going to have capability to be able to do HDR in this camera by using Picture Profile 10. Alright, with that, I think that's going to about do it. But again, Picture Profile 1 is the one that I use, and I find that it produces a much more natural, much more pleasing image than these cameras tend to ship from the factory. I've worked with other companies who use Z150s, and I can tell you that I've almost never seen anybody change that from the factory setting, and I hear people complain about some of the quality of the image from the factory, and I would have to agree that if you shoot in Picture Profile 4, like these cameras come out of the box, that yeah, they don't look that great. switch over to picture profile 1, make these adjustments, and you're going to get a fantastic image in most every situation. Okay, so that's going to about do it for now. I know there's a lot of information here, so this is going to be kind of a bit of a lengthy video compared to some of my others. But I think for anybody who's shopping for cameras and you shoot a lot of the different types of events like I do, a camera this style, camcorder, is probably going to give you a lot more flexibility and a lot more capabilities than you will get with all the other options that are out there. And yet it's something that people don't talk about very much. I think it has that stigma of being too old school, even though there's a lot of technology in here that's extremely modern, and these, I think, produce a better quality image than a lot of the other options that are out there. So if you have any questions about this or anything else related to video production, you can leave that in the comment section down below. Or even better, join us over on Discord. You can go to djp.li/discord, and that will take you over to my Discord server. We've got a whole bunch of different channels discussing video production, and there is a channel there for discussing cameras, and so we can talk about this and other cameras that are out there, and if you're just getting started, maybe help you get pointed in the right direction to find what's going to work for you for the types of things that you're going to be doing. So that's going to do it. So thanks everybody for watching, and have a fantastic day.